May 17, 1951. RAF Leiston, Suffolk, England. Two American pilots climb into their jets, perform their final checks, and file a routine training sortie that should last no more than 90 minutes. They never come back. They are Captain Thomas Tom Hargreaves, age 31, a decorated pilot who fought over Europe in the final years of World War II and stayed on as a test and training pilot, and First Lieutenant Marcus Hale, age 24, a promising young aviator on his second overseas tour and, by all accounts, eager, steady-handed, and cautious. The aircraft assigned, two F-84 Thunderjets, early post-war jets that were modern, fast, and demanding to fly. The assigned mission, a low-level navigation cross-country, instrument checks, and a short aerial gunnery practice over the North Sea training range. At 8:12 Greenwich Mean Time, both aircraft take off into a sky the weather services later described as clear with mild wind. The base radios exchange routine check-ins. At 8:27, Hargreaves reports visual on weather stack, proceeding to range. At 8:29, Hale radios back, Roger, following, altitude 2000. After that, both transmissions end. Ground radar shows two blips continuing past the coastline for approximately 12 minutes. Then the radar track shows a sudden divergence. One blip drops below the radar horizon and never returns. Ground teams dispatch rescue, and the Ministry of Defense calls in surface vessels. The sea is scoured by cutter and sonar boats. There is no debris, no oil sheen, no survivors. The official conclusion, released in a 5-paragraph communique 3 months later, was terse. Probable controlled flight into sea due to instrument malfunction. No evidence of hostile action or third-party involvement. Search and rescue recovered no wreckage. Families were paid small, classified consolation sums. The file was closed. Someone kept a copy of that file. For decades, it became one of those quiet, painful entries on memorial walls. Names read aloud each Armistice Day, while friends and relatives whispered that the official explanation fell thin, like cloth draped over something too jagged to be smoothed. But then, 60 years after May 17, 1951, the story began to crack. If you want regular deep dives like this, documents, interviews, and timeline visuals, hit subscribe and drop a comment. Should we publish the full archive of the recovered flight logs? In 2011, a retired radar technician named Graham Whitcomb contacted a small aviation blogger after discovering a stack of magnetic tape reels in the back of an outbuilding at his late father's small coastal repair yard in Norfolk. Whitcomb's father had been contracted to the ministry in the 1950s to perform maintenance on early radar sets. Equipment so primitive by modern standards, it required constant manual recalibration. The tapes were labeled in a hand that matched base logbooks. Lakenheath, 1951, May 17th. Ops! The blogger forwarded the tapes to a private researcher. The tapes, when digitized by audio archaeologists, yielded more than a local blotter. A near-continuous radar sweep annotated by voice logs from an operator known only as Operator K. Interleaved in the annotations was an off-the-books voice the digitizers later identified as a second operator. Soft, clipped, and conspicuously cautious. Those tapes contained 3 things that changed the case forever. A radar track anomaly. At 8:38 Greenwich Mean Time, 2 radar returns that had been following each other split. One return performed a slow, impossible turn at altitude, then vanished from the record in a sharp vertical drop inconsistent with a standard jet stall pattern. The other return continued, and then performed a lightning-fast lateral displacement across 3 degrees of azimuth in less than 2 seconds, a movement the tape's annotator called glitchy but solid. The tape's original logging left the phrase, "not a mechanical failure," crossed out and replaced with, in the margin, a suppressed voice transmission. Embedded faintly beneath the radar operator's notes on a secondary track labeled backup is a fragment of voice transmission, "Hargreaves, what the hell is that?" followed by a burst of static. The tape's quality makes it impossible to be certain, but analysts familiar with 1950s radio identified the cadence as a pilot voice and the syllabic stress plausible for Hargreaves' known speech pattern, a post-event command. At 9:02, the operator's voice signs off of the terse line. Take everything out of the log from 8:36 to 8:44. Make a new print. That instruction is immediately followed on the same track by a lower voice answering. Done. We'll mark as radar noise. There is no record of who that voice is. When the digitized tapes were played for the researchers, journalists, retired pilots, and archivists, the room fell silent. The official file had no mention of voice fragments or ordered log edits. Yet here, on a brittle magnetic spool, was a voice ordering the expunging of an 8-minute window from official radar records. The Ministry of Defense, when contacted by the journalist who broke the story in 2012, refused to comment on the authenticity of the tape. We cannot corroborate these materials, a MOD spokesperson said in a statement that read like a closed door. Within weeks, the blog that published the tapes was flooded with threats, anonymous emails, and a redacted complaint from an unknown legal office claiming copyright over serialized radar data. The families, especially the widowed mother of Marcus Hale, Evelyn Hale, then in her 90s, felt vindicated and violated in equal measure. They always said accident, Evelyn told a local paper, her voice thin as tissue. But boys don't just disappear. Not Tom, not Marcus. Like what you're hearing. Smash that like button if you want a dedicated episode breaking down the radar tape second by second with expert commentary. To tell what might have happened, it helps to understand who these men were and what they flew. Captain Thomas Tom Hargreaves served in the European theater in 1944, the 45 flying P-51 Mustangs, and returned to England as an instructor. Known for an almost obsessive attention to instrument checks, Hargreaves kept notebooks, tucked away after his disappearance, detailing marginal adjustments to throttle response, flap tolerances, and a grudging admiration for the new F-84's raw speed. His friends described him as not reckless, but curious, a man who would press at the edge of the machine to learn its secret. First Lieutenant Marcus Hale was younger, an ex-RAF exchange pilot who had enlisted with a scholarship drive. Hale's letters home talked about the jet's newness, its tendency to bite at low speed, and the exhilaration of breaking the sound of thought in its thin aluminum skin. He idolized Hargreaves, called him Tommy, and was working toward earning the right to lead flights. The Republic F-84 Thunderjet was an early jet with a straight wing and a turbojet engine that delivered high power, but came with quirks. Early variants experienced fuel flow interruptions, hydraulic oddities, and, most notoriously, unexplained sudden yaw under certain atmospheric conditions. Maintenance logs from Lakenheath show both jets were clear for flight after pre-dawn checks. Fuel levels were nominal, control surfaces were within tolerance, and both pilots logged green checks. Yet the night before the flight, an unusually powerful geomagnetic storm, recorded in civilian observatories and dismissed as mild in official logs, had rippled ionospheric layers over the North Sea, creating the kind of short-lived radio blackouts that can shuffle instruments and confuse radar returns. Most aviation investigators would point at instrument failure or spatial disorientation. Two jets in perfect weather, both of them, disappear without debris is, in principle, explainable through those avenues. But the tapes and the suppressed voice undermine such a neat closure. Someone, had intervened with a record. Want a printable timeline for this case? Dates, witness statements, radar stamps? Comment timeline, and we'll make one and release it for subscribers. Official search reports contain the usual. Cutter logs, sonar sweeps, drifting nets, no wreckage. But the SEER remembers differently. On the morning of May 18th, a day after the disappearance, a fisherman named Raymond Ray Lister Cromer reported to local Coast Guards that he'd seen two flashes, like lightning, down by the horizon at roughly 8:45 the previous day. Ray's tiny trawler was a few miles east of the range. He said the sea was calm, not a ripple, and the flashes were not explosions, more like reflections, then a shimmer like heat off tarmac, but on the water. The Coast Guards logged Ray's statement, but marked it as unsubstantiated. Lighthouse keeper Edith Harrow, a woman whose journals later became a trove for folklorists, wrote in her ledger, 8:40, May 17th, sky bright. Far out, two lights, one steady, one like a small star that moved oddly, then vanished. Seabirds disturbed, then silent. Dogs on cliff barked, then stilled. Edith's description was haunting in its mundanity. She noted that her radio static was worse that day, and that her men had complained of voices under voices on shortwave. Both statements were never included in the official aftermath report. Local papers buried the accounts under naval dispatches. But when researchers cross-checked Ray and Edith's notes against the digitized spool, uncanny overlaps emerged. The flashes roughly aligned with the split radar returns and with the suppressed voice fragment. That raised a question nobody wanted to ask out loud for decades. If both pilots were in the air and something anomalous happened, was it an environmental phenomenon, a secret technology, or, as Whispers later proposed, something non-human? Most professionals reject the non-human theory out of hand. But the pattern of evidence, unreturned radar blips, expunged logs, civilian witnesses of lights and silence, forced even conservative investigators to admit they could not exclude an unknown cause. If you want us to interview Ray's grandson, who still owns the trawler, and Edith's niece, who still keeps the ledger, type interviews in the comments. We'll crowdsource travel costs if enough people pledge. Sifting through boxes donated by the Hargreaves and Hale families yielded fragments of 2 lives that make the loss feel intimate again, letters, scrawled maintenance notes, and 1 photograph. Hargreaves' notebook contained an obsessive list titled Odd Readings, made with charted anomalies, wobbles at 2,000 feet, compass drift plus 8 degrees L, temporary drop in RPM on throttle advance. Hale wrote home about a strange greenish light over the water the other night, and how Tom had joked that, if anything's going to take us, I hope it sends a postcard. The tone is light, but the handwriting tightens on the final page. The photograph was perhaps the most disturbing piece. Found in a cedar cigar box belonging to Hargreaves, the snapshot was a Polaroid taken on the morning of May 17, 1951. It showed the 2 jets at sunrise on the tarmac, Tom leaning against his plane like a man about to go fishing for the sky, Marcus grinning with a cigarette between his fingers. But in the far left of the frame, just above the horizon, there's a faint smear, an overexposed sliver that, when enhanced by modern imaging software, looks like a vertical column of light, too narrow and too regular to be lens flare. The box smelled faintly of sea. To Hargreaves' mother, the picture felt like a sin. He sent that to me the same morning, she said decades later. He said the light was nothing, just sunrise. I wish I'd told him to stay. None of these domestic artifacts were in the ministry's file. The photograph, the notebook, the ledger, small human things, reassemble a story that the official report had reduced to form language and boxes checked. Want us to release a downloadable high-res scan of the Polaroid and censored for your analysis? Comment Polaroid, and we'll add it to the Patreon tier for deep dive supporters. When the whistleblower tapes surfaced in 2011, they reignited a dormant FOIA, Freedom of Information, push. The new request turned up a set of documents marked closed national security considerations. Among them, a short internal memo dated June 5, 1951, from an unnamed operations liaison recommending that press inquiries be deflected, families to be briefed by local commanders only. Attached to the memo was an unsigned line, do not disclose radar anomalies, mark as equipment noise. Another document, an expense ledger, listed an outlay to an industrial maintenance company in Hull for temporary retrieval of submerged object, May 1951. The ledger provided coordinates and a sparse description. Task incomplete, no recovery, equipment failure. Those coordinates, when plotted, fell some 6 nautical miles from where official searches had claimed to have concentrated. The ledger was stamped with initials later identified as an obscure counterintelligence office operating within the ministry's supply chain. The implication was suggestive. A directed, limited, and ultimately secret recovery attempt had occurred at an unofficial location. Then there were the men in suits. Several independent testimonies mentioned them. 2 men in dark coats seen walking briskly along the Lakenheath tarmac the morning after the disappearance. A black sedan and a sun-drenched Labor of the Day radar tapes were collected. And most chillingly, a young technician who later testified privately that as a cadet, he was ordered to race anything recorded between 8:36 and 8:44 and to obey without question. The technician described the man as sharp, dry-voiced, and claiming to be from a department you don't want to know about. He refused to reveal more even under oath and said that he still dreams of those 8 minutes. We use the phrase men in suits because in the 50s, classified technical men rarely wore uniforms. They understood bureaucracy and used it to disappear the weird. To the families, the men in suits were a more human face of the same erasure, neat edges around a hole in the record. If you want a dedicated visual piece on the men in suits, portraits, reenactments, and archival overlays, press like and we'll prioritize it for the next episode. The official investigators presented a tidy case, instrument malfunction compounded by pilot spatial disorientation. There are, to be fair, plausible elements to this theory. Early jets were temperamental. Sudden yaw or compressor surge at low altitude could have fed into the pilot's vertigo and caused both men to lose control over water, an unforgiving environment for a fast jet. That scenario accounts for radar signatures that seem to end in vertical drops. Yet it cannot account for everything. Why were there orders to excise radar records? Why the suppression of voice fragments? Why did private recovery attempts occur at coordinates never disclosed? And why did witnesses report strange lights and abrupt animal silence? Other theories that circulate among small, skeptical groups include secret technology experimentation. During the early 50s, NATO and Allied services experimented with radar jamming, early stealth concepts, and electromagnetic projects intended to shield assets from Soviet reconnaissance. Could an experimental radar/EM system have interacted with the aircraft, producing the aberrant radar traces, and potentially interfering with instruments? Unknown atmospheric phenomena. The North Sea's weather can produce mirages, plasma phenomena, and transient ionization layers. Could a rare ionospheric event have caused localized electromagnetic interference strong enough to mislead instruments and produce visual anomalies? Deliberate interdiction. Less credible to most historians, but persistent in small circles. The suggestion that the planes were intercepted by means not disclosed and removed. If true, motivated by security concerns, the men in suits would have had reasons to suppress evidence. Non-conventional explanations. These are the least supported by empirical evidence, but the most gripping to the public imagination. Sightings of geometric lights, sudden silence, and vanishing matter suggest a sudden encounter with something outside current technology. To a trained investigator, the pattern looks like this. Something occurred that produced observable anomalies. Official actors were ordered to suppress or reframe the record. Families and civilians noticed but were marginalized, and small back-channel recovery efforts occurred. In the absence of a smoking gun, the motives of the suppressing actors remain ambiguous. Secrecy breeds suspicion, particularly when a state's response is to close, not clarify. Which theory do you think is most likely? Vote in the poll pinned to this video. Instrument failure, secret tech, deliberate interdiction, other. Tell us why in the comments. When the digitized tapes and family artifacts were released in 2012, the story ricocheted from niche blogs into national press, and then into a small documentary that won a festival prize. Public interest forced the ministry into a partial rear view. The new panel, composed of retired flyboys, a forensic audio expert, a radar historian, and an independent journalist, was allowed to examine redacted materials. They concluded two things publicly: that some records had indeed been modified, and that the modification had been ordered by a then high-ranking official for reasons tied to ongoing defense protocols. They refused to identify the official, but privately, the panelists, bound by non-disclosure for additional classified materials, left with questions that haunted them. The audio expert believed the suppressed voice was a pilot transmission. The radar historian insisted the split track moving in the way recorded was not consistent with mechanical failure alone. One panel member, a retired rear admiral, told the investigative journalist off the record, "Something happened down there that someone worried would become a story about us, and so they buried it." That doesn't mean it wasn't an accident. It means they were terrified of the implications. Fear, in this sense, becomes as potent as evidence. Public pressure led to a modest concession, a partially declassified packet with selected tapes and photocopies. The ministry maintained that full release would compromise methods and sources. It was a sort of line that can be true and also dishonest. CTA, want the raw transcripts we were allowed to publish? Donate to the research fund, and we'll send the packet to donors who pledge before the month ends. Links in the pinned comment. The final public twist came in 2015 when a recreational diver, Imelda Emmy Brooks, exploring an unremarkable wreck near the coordinates listed in the hull ledger, surfaced with an object. Emmy, who had been diving the North Sea for decades, had an instinct for the curious. A rusted metallic plate with stamped identifiers that did not match any aircraft registry in the open catalog. The plate was badly corroded, a thin rectangle scored by years of salt, but the numerals N5-1274 were legible under careful scraping. Emmy turned the plate over to an independent lab. Metallurgists said the alloy composition was consistent with early 1950s aerospace alloys, but with a compound layering unusual for standard F-84 construction. In lay terms, the plate looked like it came from a contemporary aircraft, but had been augmented with materials used in experimental systems. The mod, when presented with the plate, requested custody. The sample vanished after being taken from the lab. The lab's owner reported receiving a call from an unnamed man who told me to stop poking around. He declined further comment after a polite letter and a visit from unspecified officials. Emmy's tale and the plate's brief life on the public stage crystallized a story for many. There had been a recovery attempt, some had been collected, and then the trail went cold. If you're shocked by this disappearance of evidence, share this video and tag a friend. We'll keep pushing until the full archive is public. We never find all the answers. 2 pilots took a routine sortie on a clear morning and vanished. The official line, instrument failure, bad luck, was plausible enough to seal an administrative conclusion. But the tapes, the photograph, the ledger, the plate, and the human account stitch a different texture into the fabric of the event. Anomalies whose hints were smoothed over by a system that preferred closure to complexity. Silence becomes evidence when those charged with preserving truth rearrange records to make silence plausible. Families who were denied fuller explanations kept vigil anyway, and their small acts, letters, notebooks, Polaroids, became the final, stubborn record. The world is full of completed reports and half-open drawers. The story of Captain Thomas Hargreaves and First Lieutenant Marcus Hale is one of those drawers, shut, relabeled, and stored. People who care, a whistleblower, a fisherman, a lighthouse keeper, an amateur diver, a retired technician, keep finding it and prying it open. Each time, the light inside is small but telling. If anything is certain, it is this: the sky remembers. So do the sea, and the truth, while delayed, seems patient. If this story chilled you, subscribe and support our investigative series. We're compiling the full document archive, interview footage, and high-resolution scans for our patrons. Comment below what you think happened to Hargreaves and Hale, and if you have any leads, email us. We'll follow up. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, and keep asking the quiet questions.